Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the DGAP morning briefing. I'm Henning Hoff, Executive Editor of Internationale Politik Quarterly. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which was the reason that we launched these briefings, enters day 741, 2 years, 12 days. The European Commission published its first ever European Defence Industrial Strategy yesterday, but an all-encompassing effort to enhance Europe's security and its military support for Ukraine is still lacking. This may well prove very costly given events and developments in the United States, which are the focus of this week's briefing. Super Tuesday, with primaries held in 16 federal states and territories, saw few surprises, at least as far as the presidential race is concerned. Nikki Haley, Donald Trump's last remaining challenger for the Republican nomination, won only one contest in Vermont, but later announced that she would suspend her campaign. On the Democrat side, US President Joe Biden surprisingly lost the primary in the US territory of American Samoa to a certain Jason Palmer. No need to remember his name, though he won't be president. Rather, is a Biden versus Trump rematch now inevitable? What else is Super Tuesday telling us? And what does it mean for Germany and Europe? To discuss this, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Stormy Annika Mildner, Executive Director of the Aspen Institute in Germany and a seasoned expert on the United States and transatlantic relations, not least its economic dimensions. Welcome, Stormy. Also with us is Rachel Tausendfreund, Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and, full disclosure, my former editorial colleague and predecessor. Rachel is currently part of the GMF's Geostrategy team. Inter alia, she is the co-host of Transatlantic Takeaways, a podcast produced in cooperation with Common Ground Berlin. Warm welcome to you, Rachel.
Always happy to be home at DGAP.
We are really pleased to have you. And last but not least, we have Dominic Toksdorf with us, Research Fellow, US Politics and Transatlantic Relations here at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Before joining DGAP 2 years ago, Dominic worked as a Program Director for Foreign and Security Policy at the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Washington, D.C. Good morning, Dominic.
Good morning.
Some quick housekeeping remarks. To start us off, I'll be asking each of our speakers about key takeaways of Super Tuesday and the likely consequences for Europe and Germany. After some discussion on the panel, about 30 minutes in, we will be opening for your questions and comments. For the Q&A, please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and put your question in person to the panel. You're always also welcome to submit questions and comments via the chat function. Please note that this briefing will be recorded and that we have to close on time at 9:30 a.m. And with a word of thanks to Jan Stöckmann, Head of the Director's Office, and to the DGAP Central and Eastern European expert Milan Nitsch, who keep these briefings running, as well as our colleagues in the events and communication teams. Let's start with Stormy and her takeaway of Super Tuesday.
Yeah, thank you so much, Henning. And I want to also start with the thanks for these geopolitics, geoeconomic briefings in the morning. They're really fantastic. And if they hadn't been invented yet, somebody should have done that. And thank you so much for the excellent moderation, as always, and the kind introduction. So as you already said, that there were very little surprises going into the Super Tuesday. And that is also my first takeaway. It showed the strength as well as the weaknesses of both candidates. And as such, it was not very surprising, but still very interesting. And I'm pretty sure that both campaigns are now seriously sitting down, looking at demographics, who voted where, and also at the exit polls, because there are some interesting takeaways, I would say. I took away 4 things from Super Tuesday. The first one is that if you look at the voter turnout and excitement in the voter basis, it clearly shows that both candidates, Trump as well as Biden, are not overly popular in the American population. And you can see that also very clearly in the polls. Currently, Trump is a little bit ahead of Biden, but in the popularity polls, both of them do not fare very well in the general public. My second takeaway concerns Trump. So what we have seen is that he's still very good in mobilizing his own bases. He appears pretty dynamic and a little bit younger than Biden, although he really isn't. And he can be happy that one of the big irritants is now gone, Nikki Haley. But there are also some problems for him. And this concerns, again, Nikki Haley and her voters, because those are voters who are not 100% in the Trump camp with regard to populism and also isolationism and also his style. She was able to win independents. And the big question is what is going to happen with that voter pool. And Biden already said, well, come to me and we'll see what's going to happen. Trump also has a problem with cities and the suburbs. And he also has a problem with voters with higher degrees of education. My third takeaway concerns Biden. And here we have seen that the turnout was solid, but not overly excited. A plus, I would say, is that his campaign seems to gain a little bit more traction and also dynamism. But his big problem are young and progressive voters, the more liberal voters, and also the swing states. And we already saw that in one primary before Super Tuesday in Michigan. And since we know that elections in the US are mostly decided in the swing states and by very small margins, it's really, I mean, these are the voters which who will be fought about in the next month. And my last takeaway concerns the exit polls and the topics which Americans are really very worried about. And one of them is the economic situation, which is surprising because on first look, because the US economy is doing so much better than ours with regard to growth, inflation, unemployment, all much better than we are currently experiencing. But not everybody benefits from this. And if you look at blue-collar workers, lower income groups, their wages are not improving as much as inflation is still going on. So they feel that actually, and it's not just a feeling, it is reality, that they are worse off than in 2016 to 2019 before the COVID pandemic. And although obviously all the repercussions of the pandemic and the economic situation is not something with which Biden caused, it is still attached to his presidency. And that's a huge problem for the Biden administration. So they need to have a better narrative, also with regard to his legislative successes. And there are lots of other topics which I'm sure we are going to talk about, like right of abortion, but also migration and the southern border, which fared very high in the exit polls. And I leave it with this. These are my 4 takeaways.
Thank you very much, Stormy, for this very concise reply. Let's move on to Dominic, please. Your takeaways of Super Tuesday.
Yeah, thank you very much, Henning. And of course, I share much of Stormy's assessment. I think my main takeaways is, first of all, of course, the results confirm again that Donald Trump is dominating the Republican Party and is setting the agenda. And now it will be important, as Stormy already mentioned, will be important to see where or how Nikki Haley's supporters what they will do, if they will in the end decide to support Trump or not. At least there seem to be some parts of her supporters that are not willing to go that way. And Biden really has to come up with a plan how to reach them. Also, as Stormy already mentioned, he has problems in the suburbs. He has problems with women, and also he needs to reach more independence. At the same time, and that's my second takeaway, Biden also has to watch out. It will be important to watch if the momentum around the protest vote that is taking place during the primaries, how that will play out in the general election. The fact that in some primaries, you would have more than 10% of people that voted choose uncommitted should be a warning sign for Biden. And this is clearly a protest vote against the Israel policy or the handling of the situation by the Biden administration. But I think it's also going a little bit beyond that. It's not only that issue, but also the frustration with the progressive wing within the Democrats with many of Biden's policies. So I think the pressure will be growing on Biden to basically handle the Israel situation. And one point that is going a little bit beyond, and that would be my third takeaway, that's going beyond the Super Tuesday results, is Biden will try to benefit from Trump's rhetoric, about retribution, etc., if he's elected. And because Biden knows that many voters actually see Trump as a threat to democracy, and may opt in the end. I think this is a little bit a strategy. They may opt in the end for Biden in November as the lesser evil of the two. But I think Biden also has to watch out. He shouldn't overdo that, especially independent voters. And I think that's also what Stormy mentioned. They might get tired of that narrative, right? That they want to have a discussion on the real policy issues. As you mentioned, the high cost of living, but also migration and the border security, which I think that would be my fourth takeaway. Border security and migration will be one of the big campaign topics. Here, Biden can argue that the Republicans opposed the deal that was on the table a few weeks ago in the Senate, and that Republicans are not really interested in any real policy solutions. But at the same time, I think he also knows that he has sort of ignored that topic for way too long, and the pressure is growing on him to take some actions on the border security. So we may see some executive action in the next weeks that will be interesting to watch. And maybe my last point, it will be interesting to see how much support third-party candidates can get in the run-up to the elections, especially RFK Jr. He's now working on getting the approval to be on the ballot in many states. I think he got enough signatures lately in Arizona and Georgia and Nevada, which are, of course, important battleground states. And how he's faring there in the general elections will be really interesting. Also because he could potentially be a threat to Biden, especially maybe a little bit to Trump, but I think especially for Biden.
Thank you very much, Dominic, for your points. And let's move on to Rachel. Please, your takeaways.
Yes, thanks for having me. So I'm playing a cleanup hitter in this round. And since I don't disagree with anything that Stormy and Dominic said, I won't do that. I'll just dig into a few points a bit deeper. I mean, it's a strange result when you have the very obvious candidates winning without a surprise on Super Tuesday, right? Super Tuesday, normally I have to stay up really late or get up really early and watch the results. This year, that wasn't necessary. You would think that would mean you'd have two very strong candidates, but in fact, we have two very weak candidates. And that we've seen throughout, and we saw it again on Super Tuesday. And I can assure you, Americans agree with you. Why are these the two candidates? 70% of Americans are unhappy with a Trump-Biden rematch. So we think the exact same thing you're thinking. Why is this the case? And yet it is the case. We have Biden and Trump. As Stormy and Dominic mentioned, turnout underscores the fact that people are not very excited. One point I just want to underscore, it's only a surprise to us, specifically in Germany, I guess, that American Samoa picked some random guy that no one's ever heard of. I think we, and I mean also Germany here, need to take that as a signal of how the rest of the world is viewing Israel-Palestine, right? They'd rather vote for some random guy no one's ever heard of because they're very, very, very outraged by what's going on in Israel-Palestine. And that's how the rest of the world sees this. And that is a huge problem for Biden. This protest vote was already mentioned. This was a campaign that was started in Michigan because as the largest Arab American population in the US, it has a huge Arab American population and some majority Arab American cities, in fact. And it was quite successful in Wayne County, which is the sort of Arab American county, and in Washtenaw County, which is the university county right next to it. There was 18% of this uncommitted vote, which is a protest vote against Biden. You saw big numbers also in Minnesota, which has a pretty significant, mostly Somali Arab American population, or Arab, not yet American in some cases, population. And there the numbers were also in the high teens. But you also saw numbers that are pretty significant in North Carolina, about 12% voted uncommitted. So that's where you see it's also a bit of a kind of young progressive thing, even though the main thrust of it, and it really gained force because of younger voters and Arab Americans being really upset about Biden's support for Netanyahu. You've seen also changes in the Biden campaign as a result. Sort of Kamala Harris got the approval to go out publicly and distance herself a little from the policy just a couple weeks ago. So the message is being received in the Biden camp, but it's not as if Netanyahu is actually listening to Biden. So that's the other problem. So that's a big weakness for Biden, in addition to, frankly, his age and lack of energy. So he goes into this week. I'm going to focus on Haley and the Haley voters. So as Henning said at the beginning, Haley only won Vermont on Super Tuesday, and then suspended her campaign. Her speech at the suspension was quite interesting because she didn't endorse Trump, but she also didn't not endorse Trump. She said basically he needs to convince my voters, and it's not clear how to read that. So you could read it as an invitation to offer her the VP spot. That's one way of convincing her voters. She was in his previous administration. Unlike Chris Christie, she wasn't sort of a really violent critic of Trump's, and she focused a lot of her critique on foreign policy. So I think it's possible that that's a sort of invitation to be asked for the VP spot. That would fix some of Trump's weaknesses there, the ones that Dominic and Stormy pointed out, that I think are significant, right? If he doesn't fix those weaknesses, Biden has good chances. Maybe with Haley as a VP, he could bring along some of her independent suburban women voters. So that's the open question for me. If Trump wants to win the election, he could pick Haley as VP. If he, however, wants someone who will go along with him, if he, for example, wants to again, overturn election results or do similar unconstitutional types of things, he probably won't want to pick Haley, right? So I'm not sure what his calculation is going to be there.
Yeah, maybe Rachel, we can just throw in one question from the chat. Could Haley be an independent candidate? Do you see that happening?
She could be, but probably she won't be. There's no indication that she's going to do that. There is also this kind of spoiler rule that many states have, where someone who lost the primary isn't then allowed to run as an independent candidate. So it's possible to circumvene that, but that would add in a complication. So I don't expect her to be an independent candidate. If she wants, what she could do is sort of publicly keep undermining Trump if he doesn't offer her a spot without being a candidate. I think that's the more likely option.
Thank you very much. And we are all waiting, of course, for Joe Biden's State of the Union address, which I think is today. And from what I've read is that he probably will put sort of this democracy is on the ballot as a sort of as a key part of his response to Super Tuesday and the coming election campaign. But let's turn now to our second round. Again, a very quick one, a very rushed one, and we agreed to go in reverse order. So each candidate has a sort of each of our panelists. None of them is only Rachel probably would be entitled to run for U.S. president, not the others, I'm afraid. But let's do a quick round. What it all means for Germany, Europe, and the world, perhaps. And Rachel, you want to start with some comments on sort of global and particular China policy. Rachel, please again.
Sure. So it means a lot of things in the chat. I think there's a scenario exercise a very short one that I wrote about some of the implications of a Biden-Trump rematch. The sort of European security stuff Dominic wants to talk about, that's actually sort of the clearest point. But I think if we have a Biden-Trump matchup and we don't have a Nikki Haley VP, Nikki Haley as VP is a slightly moderating force. Nikki Haley's very old school Republican foreign policy. She has also a husband who's a major in the military. But let's just take pure Biden and pure Trump. And as much as the Biden administration has really escalated its sort of challenge to China, or its de-risking, as they've now adopted from the European strategy towards China with all kinds of moves, there has also been a kind of moderation in tone towards the end of the first term. And with Trump, you would have the most escalated rhetoric and activity that you had in the Biden administration, plus some, meaning tensions can be expected to rise quite significantly with China. And of course, as we saw in the first term, there will be very little interest in trying to coordinate our approach with Europe, right? So tensions will rise, danger will rise because he's, more unpredictable, and there'll be a lot less space for Europe to sort of be included in discussing any of these things. So that's, unfortunately, that's an area to be concerned about. One strange way in which Biden and Trump align is this kind of like technological manufacturing focus. So as much as Trump doesn't really care about the environmental aspects of the IRA, he's quite happy with the rest of it, and things like chip production, bringing these things back home that have both a security and a domestic production angle. I would expect him to double down on those to the extent that he can. And I would also expect, a lot of the things that will be more coordinated this time around in his administration have a domestic focus, a very problematic, very problematic ends on the Democratic realm. Small d Democratic there. But I think you'll also have a more coordinated, stricter line in foreign policy, because there's a lot of the old school Republicans I don't expect are going to be in the top tiers of the administration. And Biden will continue as Biden has. I think they'll continue on this semi-moderated tone, but nonetheless a very consistent, taking security and economic threat very seriously and focusing on both green and manufacturing. So more of the same, or escalated and less stable, and certainly less pro-European.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Let's move on to Dominic and your take on what it means, sort of particularly in the security field, please.
Yeah, thanks, Henning. And yeah, of course, I agree with Rachel. That sort of also the domestic policies will play a much more important role also under Trump. Of course, it makes a huge difference for Germany and Europe if there's a Biden or a Trump presidency. And I think it's not only in security policies, but also on trade and climate, but also when it comes to the tone and, the sort of the trust between both partners. And if Trump is really elected, this may lead to a fundamental change of the US role in European security that has been discussed already quite a lot. But I think it needs to be repeated that, from day one, the commitment by the United States to NATO and Article 5 would be in question. Trump may pick the concept of the dormant NATO, as has been proposed, for example, in the Project 2025, in which the US would basically expect Europe to take on the large share of the conventional forces to deter Russia, and the US would keep a nuclear umbrella in Europe, but even that might be put in question by Trump. And of course, the Ukraine portfolio, the Ukraine policy would be very unpredictable under Trump. So, I mean, Germany and Europe would need to invest much more in defense. That's basically a no-brainer nowadays, and also in a more coordinated fashion. And also, they need to invest much more in supporting Ukraine. But I would say this wouldn't only be under Trump. Of course, that would also be the case if Biden is re-elected, because no matter who will be in government in the United States, the US will expect Europe to take on more leadership with regards to Ukraine, in supporting Ukraine, and also increasing and ramping up its defense industrial production. And it should, right? Because it is very much in the European security interest to do that. So some governments have been lagging behind on that. They've wasted time in the last 2 years for this. And I think now the blockade in Congress over the new Ukraine assistance package shows that there's even more urgency to quickly respond to these challenges in Europe. And I think Europe should also not lean back now if the supplemental that is currently discussed in the House of Representatives will finally pass. Nobody knows if this will pass or not, but even if it's passed, it shouldn't be a sign that Europe can lean back and the US will stay involved. I don't think that would be the case. But I think overall, these discussions in Congress in the last few weeks have made clear not only that Ukraine assistance and US policy on Ukraine is no longer secure. We don't really know in which direction this is going, but it's also an indicator that the sort of consensus on foreign policy issues in the United States, especially in Congress, that has existed for a really long time, no longer exists nowadays. And we in Europe have to get used to that idea that the sort of isolationist foreign policy strand will be a factor in Congress in the years to come. I mean, polls show over and over again that the sort of part of the population in the US is more skeptical towards entanglements or engagements abroad, no matter in what form, and especially among Republican voters. And that trend, of course, has increased again since Trump has regained strength. So even if that's not a majority opinion in the United States in the population, this sort of skepticism will be part of the population, but also will be represented in Congress. So it will be a factor in all sorts of foreign policy decisions in the United States, and that's something that the European allies and other allies have to take into account. And unless, of course, you would have a Democratic president and the Democrats would sort of control the House and the Senate, but that seems very unlikely at the moment. And I would say this doesn't mean that the US will completely withdraw even under Trump, right? It won't completely withdraw from the world stage, of course not. But its engagement might become much more narrow under a Trump presidency than it's, of course, under Biden right now.
Thank you very much, Dominic. And now the last word of this round goes to Stormy. Sort of what is your reading of the consequences for Germany and Europe in particular?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm going to take a closer look at the economic side of the equation. First of all, I want to agree with both Dominic and Rachel on the style and the partnership approach, that is definitely going to be very different, obviously, under a Biden and a Trump administration. When I remember the time when in 2017, Trump took over the White House and it was the German G20 presidency, it was a huge change with regard to predictability and trust and partnership also among the allies. And that is something and also his transactional approach to many issues and things, but mostly also this erratic approach and this unpredictability. That is something which is hard to get ready for, so to say, and it's hard to deal with. And I think this is also part of his program and his approach to keep everybody on his tippy toes. And to consciously create this uncertainty and this unpredictability. So that's my first takeaway. There is a huge difference in style and partnership approach. Secondly, I would like to take a closer look at the policy content with regard to economic policy of those two candidates. And first, remember how the times were under the Trump administration. So when he took office, the first thing, and we all remember that, was taking the US out of the climate protocol, the Kyoto Protocol. And he didn't only do this, but he had a huge deregulation policy. So he rolled back a lot, if not all, domestic climate regulations which were passed also per executive order under the Obama administration. So this is something I would expect as well, again, that we would see in his economic policy making and environmental and climate policy making a rollback of things we have seen in the last administration. What he then also did was a tax reform. So he lowered taxes, which also contributed to the increasing government debt. I would assume that there will be again a tax reform which does not benefit the lower middle income classes, but benefits mostly the business sector and higher income classes. And back then, this was also one of the reasons why the business sector wasn't so unhappy with Trump, despite the trade policy. Taxes were lower. Taxes were lower and regulations were reduced. The economic growth was pretty strong, and the stock markets were pretty high. And what he then also did, though, but that was induced by the COVID pandemic, he also passed large spending bills, large stabilizing packages, which also contributed to the high deficit. Trade is what really was the biggest problem for us. He saw trade always as a zero-sum game. He looked at trade balances. A trade surplus was seen as trading unfairly. He had very much Germany in his focus. We felt that very clearly. Trade agreements were, nothing he envisioned and wanted. He took the United States out of TP, out of the big transatlantic partnership agreement. The TTIP negotiations were immediately dead. He seriously undermined the WTO. He put tariffs on steel and aluminum, and we saw a tit-for-tat process with regard to China on tariffs. And he also took, he also implemented new sanctions with regard to Iran, also without consulting with the allies, and pretty surprising. And these are things which I would suspect to come back. And looking at the conservative projects under the Heritage Foundation, it would probably go one step further, because we see there that multilateralism is really something they are opposed or critical about. They don't like any international organization, not just the WTO, but also World Bank, IMF, and OECD. So I would expect new tariffs. I would expect a tech, but a strategy against those international organizations. And I would expect coming back to that rhetoric of the zero-sum game. And as Rachel already mentioned, I would expect, again, a very strong focus on reindustrialization and the digital transformation, but not on the green transformation. With regard to Biden and his Bidenomics, it's not all 100% different from what we saw in the Trump program, but there are differences. And that is a policy with which we can live a lot better, although we did have problems with regard to the IIA. So within Bidenomics, it's a policy for the middle class, it's reindustrialization, it's a strong focus on green and digital transition, transformation. He does that mostly via spending packages, not so much via laws and regulations. Of course, he has, laws can't, he didn't get that through Congress, big climate packages, for example. Funding packages, yes, but not any big regulatory packages. With regard to trade, there are some similarities, though. And what I see, and that had already started under the Trump administration, is a strong focus on security matters, so to say a securitization of trade, although Biden is not does not believe in a zero-sum game, but in positive sum game, so to say, but we see lots of new export controls, investment controls. I totally agree with Rachel's assessment with regard to China. Softer rhetoric, but in the substance, pretty tough nonetheless. Sanctions with regard to human rights violations, the tariffs remained as they are, so no big changes there. But no new trade agreements, in a sense, like FTAs, free trade agreements, but more, I would say, transactional trade agreements, softer trade agreements, where it's more about coordination. Wouldn't see that under Trump, but we saw it now under Biden, TTC and IPEF, and even some WTO reform packages. So to sum up, it would be for us, obviously, so much better in economic terms to have the Biden administration continue, although we need to be, and that is both the assessment of Dominic and Rachel, not everything in there is conflict-free for us, obviously. I mean, there are lots of things which we need to deal with. And I saw also in the chat, Felix asking about the IRA and how Europe should prepare for a increased industrial policy in the United States. And my takeaway would be, well, I mean, we need to get our own economic policy in order, especially in the EU. And I think we can come back to this in the discussion. But this, for me, means finally finalizing our big European project, our European market, getting rid of barriers, investing in infrastructure, and many other things we need to do, education and so on. So there is a lot we can actually do to prepare for such a case.
Thank you very much, Stormy, and thanks to the whole panel for sort of answering my questions in such a profound and encompassing way. We are past the 30-minute mark, so please join our conversation with a question or a comment. To do so, please raise your hand and put your question in person to the panel. That's always our preferred way of interaction. But while you sort of maybe wait and sort of try to get your question ready in your head, there's one by David Fouquet who's sort of asking the panelists whether they have also sort of looked deeper into congressional primaries and sort of what the trends are telling us there. I don't know who would like to come in. Rachel? Yeah.
I could take that one. So the Senate map, as I call it, is it's a very bad one for Democrats in this year. Meaning, so first of all, Joe Manchin, who was the Democratic senator of West Virginia, is retiring, and there's no chance, essentially. While Manchin was in that seat, West Virginia's flipped from Democrat to Republican almost completely. Something like an 80% Republican state. So that's already one seat that's automatically lost when Joe Manchin retires. Good, you could say Joe Manchin was sort of a Republican in many ways anyway, and there were some important aspects of legislation that he blocked. Nonetheless, he did support, the IRA and a lot of big things. So that is a loss. So that's already one seat that they're guaranteed to lose. Most of the other seats that they have to win, I think it's 6, are in difficult states. Michigan is one of them. There we have the Senate seat open. Alyssa Slotkin, who might be well known to some of you, she's a foreign policy politician actually, and she had a kind of Trump district, Trump flipped congressional district, and now she's running for Senate. She's quite strong, so right now she's ahead in the polls. She has a good chance to take that Senate seat in Michigan. But basically, for the Democrats to win a majority in the Senate, they have to win the presidency and all of the very highly contested Senate seats. Hence, odds are that they'll probably lose one of them, and the Republicans will have the majority, but a very slim majority in the Senate. House looks to be possibly the reverse. There, the Democrats have a decent chance of picking up enough seats to win the majority in the House. So it could be that it'll be the reverse of the most likely outcome is that it'll be the reverse of what we have now, a slim Republican majority in the Senate and a slim Democratic majority in the House.
Thanks very much. Dominic, you also wanted to come in. on the congressional primary?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. I think this will be, besides presidential campaigns, the sort of how this will all play out in the primaries for the congressional seats will be interesting to follow. And I completely agree with Rachel. Of course, the Senate will be difficult to keep for the Democrats, but then in the House, that will be interesting to see, right? Especially the swing seats. I think there's about like 30 swing seats left in the House. But here the Democrats seem to have good chances. First of all, I think after the whole chaos in the House in the last year or so, but then also when you look at, for example, the last special elections in New York and Long Island, where the Democrats actually got a seat which is more a Republican-leaning seat. That's one of the tendencies. And then, for example, this week, sometime there was a new decision on redistricting in Alabama, for example, where like we would have now one more district that will likely go to the Democrats, so that would be an additional seat. So I would completely agree with Rachel that the Democrats, if they have chances of getting any of the chambers, it would be the House, and that would of course be extremely important to keep, just in case Trump would become president, because that gives you a lot of power, as we see right now with the Republicans blocking everything that Biden wants to do.
Thank you very much. And we've got a first question put to us in person by my DGAP colleague, Victoria Rietig, who is the head of the migration program here. Victoria, please.
Thanks a lot, Henning, and thanks a lot to the whole panel. It's really been wonderful to listen to your insights. There has been a lot of agreement on this panel, so I thought I'd bring in a bit of disagreement just by offering not a question, but a comment on migration, because it has been mentioned by all of you as something that is discussed a lot, and we all know there was a new Gallup poll that US voters consider it the most important issue actually at this point, even before governance and the economy. But you've only mentioned so far that Biden has ignored the border to date to some degree, and I'd like to strongly disagree with that. I would argue that, to the contrary, Biden has done more than 500 migration-related executive actions, and that is more than Trump did in his entire time in office. And Trump already was the most active migration president up to that point, so Biden has actually beaten that record. And these executive actions have indeed brought about significant changes to how the border is supposed to work. Just to mention one example, he did introduce a cap for asylum seekers of maximum 1,450 a day. So this is very similar to the German debate about the Obergrenze, right? So they actually have put that in place. But the problem is that to implement these policies, you need to have the personnel and you need to have accommodation and detention spaces. Now, Biden has asked for more budget for this, but has not gotten it. So the problem we have in the US and the problem that Biden has been grappling with is that his policies are quite forward-looking and migration-related and, plenty harsh, but his policies do not change reality on the ground. Most people are simply let into the country. So in this sense, I would argue that it's quite similar to the German debate. We talk a lot about migration policies, for instance, yesterday at the Ministerpräsidentenkonferenz, and there's constantly new laws that sound harsh and that are meant to solve some of these problems, but they are rarely implemented, and therefore they don't change reality, but only paper.
Thank you very much. Rachel wants to respond to us, I think.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I'm going to then agree with Victoria, which she didn't want. But it's not true that Biden has been ignoring the border. What is true is that comprehensive legislation cannot be passed. Those who are following closely, as Victoria is, will know there was actually a bipartisan agreement on comprehensive legislation. So the reason Biden's done all these executive actions is because that's the only thing he can do, because you can't get legislation passed. There was actually a bipartisan agreement that the Republicans explicitly, publicly, cynically then decided to reject in order to keep it an election issue, because migration is a very good election issue for Trump, as we saw in 2016, when there wasn't as significant border issue as there is now. It's not, I find that it's, Victoria's watching these issues closely, but in my reading of the German press, it's, I think, undercovered the degree of the scale of the border crisis or the issue at the border. I mean, there are 150 to 250,000 people being detained, processed at the border. So those are the ones that are getting caught only every month. So we're talking 2 to 3 million a year. These are, 2015 levels. It really is a problem. It's a very significant problem, and you've had then governors or local politicians in the southern states sort of instrumentalizing it and sending the asylum seekers or migrants or refugees to northern cities. New York, because it's a sanctuary city, has a law that they have to offer housing to everyone, and they just simply are running out. So it is a huge issue. It's genuinely also an issue. In 2016, you could argue it was more a political issue than it was a real issue. 2024, it's a genuine issue for those people who are really encountering it, which are many, and also just politically, it's being, of course, then also instrumentalized by the Trump campaign, but it's a genuine issue. And unfortunately, politics is refusing to work on this issue, which means it's going to stay an unresolved problem.
Thanks so much. And Dominic, you also wanted to come in?
Yeah, very briefly. Victoria, of course, I agree with you. I mean, in the end, if you look at what has been done, it's a different thing. But the optics, I think, that are that like large parts of the population see that there hasn't been much done on this, and they see the footage in the TV where you have thousands of migrants crossing the border in December, etc. That's what I mean. I think Biden has it on his radar, but he didn't sort of find the right ways to really address it. And now he has that problem. I mean, you see that with Greg Abbott, with the decision to just say okay, we just do this on our own. We don't need the federal government to do this. We just send the National Guard. And now you have that problem that, some of the Republican governors make, and I think not only in Texas, you have a lot of other governors that agree and send their own National Guards to Texas, or have at least offered to do that. And now you have that as a problem that, the federal government is undermined, and how to address that will be a really difficult issue for Biden in the campaign.
Thank you very much. And Stormy, please.
Thank you so much. Yeah, yesterday we had our state-to-state debate where we bring state legislators together and we talked about migration. And we had a state legislator from Arizona whose district is completely at the border. And it was really interesting hearing from him, and also and he's a Democrat, his evaluation of federal policies. And I asked him yesterday, and you can listen to it on YouTube, if there is actually a border crisis. And he said, clearly, there is a border crisis. And then I asked him also, are you happy with Washington and the policies which are done? And he said, clearly, he isn't happy with this because there is just not enough done. And the border states and border districts are just overwhelmed with what they're seeing, and that it is also a humanitarian crisis. So I absolutely agree that there are tons of executive orders and regulations, but I also agree with the evaluation, and that's what we clearly heard yesterday, that not enough is done to address the hardship. Then we yesterday talked about the other side of the immigration issue, and that is the issue of labor market shortages and skills, and the need for migrants to come in and also to be placed and moved where there is actually a demand and where there is a need. And we talked about this both in the German context as well as in the US context. There is a labor shortage and it needs to be addressed, and immigration is an important part of it. But how to do this and how to how to attract skilled workers and how to really get them where they are needed. That is an issue which both of our participants yesterday were pretty unhappy about, that it is neither done well on the federal nor on the sub-federal level. And also with regard to the cooperation between those two levels, much more needs to be done.
Many thanks. I think The Economist asked recently, sort of, will the border break Biden? We'll see what happens. But we've got two raised hands. One by my DGAP colleague Florence Schimmel, who's with the Security and Defense Program here at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Florence, please.
Thank you, Henning, and thank you to the panel so far. I found it very interesting what you said with regards to Congress, how it's not only important who wins the presidency, but also who wins the House and the Senate, and how they then will support. I would like to ask a question for the scenario of a Republican presidency and Republican majorities, and how Congress then might not be in support of the president, but in opposition. I think there is one very obvious foreign policy portfolio regarding NATO and Ukraine, but maybe I'm wrong there. But I'd be curious, for example, about the whole US-American narrative and rhetoric on the war on terror, for example, and how they use it for a lot of their policies in African countries, for example. Whether you see that that there might be then opposition to a likely Trump isolationism. What's the role of Congress there? Do you see in different foreign policy portfolios a possible opposition, and as you just mentioned, the governors level, maybe also on a subnational level where that might be relevant?
Thank you very much. There's also a question by Klaus Wittmann, please.
Good morning. Also from my side, thank you very much for these interesting insights. I have a simple question to Dominic. Do you think that there is still any chance left that the military aid package might be agreed?
Thank you very much. And maybe since you've been asked directly, Dominic, maybe you want to respond to that first, and then maybe the others can come in on that and also on the other question raised by Florence.
Sure, yeah. Thank you very much for the question. I mean, honestly, I don't know. Of course, how would I know? But I mean, there's a lot of discussions around that topic in Congress right now in the House. I mean, there's a question about the discharge petition, basically, where, you know, like if you have a majority of Republicans that are supporting that legislation, the supplemental, then they could go around the Speaker of the House, who might be unwilling to put it on the floor, but that would take a lot of time, you know, so it will at least take a lot of time until this would be approved. But even that seems to be uncertain. If I may also use the opportunity, Henning, quickly to respond to Florence, a really excellent question about this. I think this is really an important question because, I mean, you can see this with the NATO. You know, the Senate or the basically Congress has added that in the last defense budget. That, you know, if Trump really wants to get out of NATO, he can't do that without Congress. That has been clear already before. But this is more the formal way. I mean, I think the problem is more that, you know, Trump could really undermine the credibility, the deterrence in Europe, right? I mean, it's not really a formal thing if the US is still part of NATO or not. It's the same with the Paris Agreement, right? It's more the actions that he could take and the signals that he could send to Putin, you know, like by signaling to Putin, basically, we won't really do much in case that there's something happening in the Baltics, for example. I think that is a threat. And maybe last part on the tariffs, I think there you can see that Trump has a lot of you know, leeway. He has a lot of flexibility on tariffs. He doesn't really need Congress for anything of that. He can just basically decide. You know, there's of course still
some people say that. Some people say that Biden is the president, but Trump reigns already. What do you say to that?
Was this for me? Sorry,
I think it was Dominic. Yeah. So
this
is the sort of...
Yeah, maybe on the Ukraine, if I understand this correctly, this is on the Ukraine thing, right? I think, yeah, you're right in the sense that, like he has a lot of power over the members of the House. And I think, I mean, you have to understand that, these people are already in the election mode themselves, right? So if Trump says something about migration, if he says something about Ukraine, they have to take it seriously, even though they might have other convictions. But they have to take that seriously, and I think like in the Ukraine case, you can see this pretty clearly that you had quite a lot of people that were actually in favor of Ukraine, but now they're really confused about what to do about this because Trump sends these signals to the members, and they are in their own campaigns, and they need to make sure that they get reelected and that there's not somebody on the right that basically takes on their spot in the primaries. I think they're all concerned about their own primaries right now, and to what extent there may be some more right contender from the right side of the Republican Party. There's still potential for that too.
Thanks very much. Jasmine, if you could mute yourself again, and I think next is Stormy and then Rachel.
Yeah, and what great question about the division of power between the executive and the legislative. What I find actually pretty amazing, looking back at the last 3 years, is Biden's ability to actually get those large spending bills through Congress, keeping his own Democrats together in both the House as well as the Senate, which wasn't so easy with regard to the IIA, but also passing the infrastructure bill with the support of some of the Republicans, that I would find pretty amazing with regard to Klaus's question, if Trump is now already ruling. It is always difficult during election times to pass any big legislative packages. And so I was not very surprised that the immigration bill in the end didn't go through, because it is very much influenced by campaign tactics. But it is really hard to govern during an election time. And even more so right now, if Republicans are afraid to divert from the Trump position. With regard to the division of power on trade issues, if you look into the Constitution of the United States, it is clearly the competence of Congress to pass laws on tariffs and to do trade policy, because in the early young republic, trade policy was tariff policy and there was revenue policy, and Congress was the so to say owner of the purse, and so trade policy belonged to the powers of Congress. But what Congress has done since the 1930s is give the president, the executive, more and more power. Power to pass trade, or no, to negotiate and more easily pass trade agreements through the Trade Promotion Authority, which Biden does not have currently. And I would also not expect Trump going for this, because he doesn't want any free trade agreements. But on the other side, also the competence to implement tariffs. And those are, for example, the national security tariffs, Section 232 of 1962. Those is the Section 301, which was passed in 1974. And there are some other legislation. And these executive, or these gave the executive power to implement tariffs. And Congress could take that away again. But that has not happened also during the last Trump administration. And the restriction of those competencies did also not happen, because you need to do that in a legislative way as well. So Trump would have a lot of leeway to implement tariffs. And it would be very hard for a Democratic, and I don't even think they would try, because of their base and the manufacturing focus and reindustrialization, to reduce that power. So I would not count on Congress to be a counterweight to a Trump administration in trade policy issues.
Thank you very much. Rachel, do you also come in? We only have 3 minutes left, so and I have
Sure,
a final question for each of them.
There's also a question in the chat, which I can very briefly try to mention. I mean, I would expect On the question of Congress, I would expect the Republicans to offer less resistance than they did in the first term. You can see this in the rhetoric of all of the people who used to oppose Trump and are doing so less and less. There was the legislation passed that any president can't withdraw from NATO without Senate approval, but that's probably not constitutional, even if they tried. And when it comes to Ukraine, we're already seeing that it's going to be hard to get Republican support, even if Joe Biden wins and if Trump wins. He, of course, is then commander-in-chief, meaning the military support that doesn't have to be approved by Congress. He gets to decide on that. And I would actually expect Donald Trump to be very consistent when it comes to Ukraine. Other NATO countries, I'm not sure, but Ukraine, I expect a very consistent lack of support for Ukraine. So that's worrying. On the question in the chat, if there's a third way, I'll just say this very briefly.
That was sort of, sorry to interrupt you, but I think that I wanted to bake into my final question. And maybe we can have a quick round on that.
Yeah, go for it.
And my question is a Trump versus Biden rematch? Is it a done deal for you? This is what you expect to happen? And if so, who wins? Who wants to go first? Rachel?
Sure, I can go first. So there is a third way. There's a kind of rogue movement going on in the Democratic Party, or supporters of the Democrats, who are arguing that there's still time until the convention for Biden to decide that he's not a strong candidate. And the then new candidate can be decided at the convention. This is like very niche, but the fact is, until 1978, the primaries were not binding in the United States. So we had a process that was a little bit more like the German process, where sort of party insiders decided who the candidate should be via the convention. And in fact, the laws haven't been changed. So that can still happen. If Biden were to free his delegates, you could have an open convention, you could have a different candidate. It's possible that at least one of the trials against Trump could be concluded before the election, probably not before the convention, although possibly one could be. So I think the odds are 90% plus that these are the candidates. But it's not impossible that they won't be, for various reasons. Also, let's not forget, these are not spring chickens. So, sudden deaths can happen at any age, but major illness increases significantly the likelihood when you're pushing 80 or 80 plus. So I think it's not impossible that it's someone else, but it's unlikely. I think we have to see that. Look, the polls haven't looked good for Biden recently, but that's because most people are forgetting what Trump is really like. This is what the Biden campaign is betting on. Once Trump is again in the media, all those kind of, the classic suburban women who are like not very happy with Biden and rightfully think the world is a scary place right now, will remember how scary Trump is, and therefore will again support Biden. Those are also my odds. I think we're looking at, I would tilt toward thinking a Biden victory is more likely, but I think it's narrow. And I think that's barring some kind of health scare, major stumble, something like this, that could very much turn things around in the last weeks.
All right. Thank you very much for being so adventurous in a way, sort of making guesses so early on. Dominic, please, short answer. You're out of time.
Yeah, honestly, I think like for both parties, the problem is if one of the candidates drops out, right? I mean, as Rachel just mentioned, there's the age problem. And if one of the parties suddenly has a younger candidate, I mean, that was always a point by Nikki Haley, right? The electability problem, if one of the parties comes up with a younger candidate, the other party immediately has to respond to that, right? And I mean, I wouldn't completely rule out that at the convention there might be some changes, that Biden suddenly says, oh, really, I'm too old for this, but this is the person that I would recommend you to go with. My delegates, go ahead with that person. But I mean, this is pure speculation. But I think the problem will really become if suddenly one of these two old sort of candidates drop out, and the other party would have to respond to that.
Thank you very much. And Stormy, final word.
It's a hard question in the end. I agree with Rachel on the 90%, but there are so many different factors, internal factors, external factors, also internationally things can happen, which then affect the elections and the campaigns, which we already saw with regard to Israel, Hamas, and Palestine. There was something which nobody would have expected 1.5 years or 1 year ago. So a lot of things can happen. And what I would just do is taking a very close look at the 6 swing states and how the campaigns are unfolding in these 6. That should be very interesting to watch and to watch both candidates, how they roll out their charming campaigns in these six states. And I know we are over time, so I keep it very short in the end.
Thank you very much. Who will win, though? What's your guess? Trump or Biden?
You don't leave me off the hook. I really don't know. I mean, obviously, there's always a hope for Biden, but as I said, there's so many different factors which can impact the outcome. That I think it's. Let's say it this way. I think we are well advised not to be the hare, the rabbit in front of the snake, but do our own homework and to prepare for both possible outcomes. That's diplomatic enough?
It is definitely for the German Council on Foreign Relations. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our excellent panel we had today on Super Tuesday on politics in the United States and what it all means for Germany and Europe in particular. Thank you for joining us this morning again, and we're looking forward to seeing you soon again at one of our DGAP morning briefings and other events. And with that, a very good morning to all, and thanks again to our panelists. Good morning.